My friends, thank you once again for being here. Please know your presence is a blessing. You know, the last few weeks, because of the events in the Middle East, especially the beheadings, a lot of questions have been raised. I've received many emails, phone calls, lots of comments, but very sincere questions. And if I have to summarize the questions, it falls into three categories, I might say. One is, does the Quran really mandate the Muslim to kill the non-Muslim? This has been going around on the internet, talk shows. Second category, Jamal, I know you talk about beautiful verses in the Quran, but I'm coming across some pretty ugly ones. There's some contradictions. Tell me something about that. Third question, please, or a request for information. Tell me something more about so-called ISIS, Isil. Who are they? How do they appear? Where did they come from? I'm confused. So very big topics, actually. So I will look at the time and, and be respectful of the time. I was about to tell you a mullah story, but I think I'll abstain from that. It was about time. So for the first question, no, the Quran does not mandate a Muslim to kill a non-Muslim. The second part about the confusion. Here's the insight. Every holy book, especially in the monotheistic tradition, and certainly in the Quran, has verses, some of which are particular verses, and some are universal verses. Universal verses are beautiful, filled with wisdom, beauty, eternal. The particular verses which relate to a specific time and incident, they need what is called textual context. They need historical context, and very often they need a higher interpretation. Where is the problem? The problem is when we advocate, we make those particular verses to be universal verses. That's a major problem. So let me even start with the one which is presented to me all the time. It's called a sword verse, although the sword is never mentioned. Kill the infidel, this is the mistranslation. Kill the pagan, kill the idolater. Yes, it does exist in the Quran. But what's the textual context of this? If you look at chapter 2, verse 190 to 194, where this also appears, there's a verse before that which says, "Fight in the way of God those who fight you, but begin not hostilities, for God loves not the aggressors." There's a verse also after the so-called sword verse, which says, "And if the pagan wants to go for peace or sue for peace, you must lay down your arms and go for peace, because God loves those who restrain themselves." This is the textual context. It also needs a historical context. You see, Islam in the 7th century, when it first started, during its inception, was a very small, embryonic, fragile community, surrounded by, outnumbered by, very powerful enemies. The entire history of Islam during the time of Prophet Muhammad is one of enduring battles, constant threats and fear. And what was the reason the large Quraysh tribe always wanted to attack the embryonic community of Prophet Muhammad? For two reasons. Because Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he challenged the ruling elite and told them, you're oppressing the poor, the marginalized, the slaves, the widows, the divorcees, the orphans. These formed a large part of his community. And this really upset them because he was really challenging the established elite order. The second reason was, Prophet Muhammad, he said, I want to call you back from your worship of the ego, the little self that idolizes money and power. So he declared, La ilaha illallah. He said, there is only one God. There is no God but God, meaning it's all one. This is the two reasons for which he was persecuted. Let me give you some more examples about how not to advocate a particular verse to be a universal verse. There's a verse in chapter 5, 51. 51 is the number of the verse, which says, take not the Jews and Christians to be your friends or protectors, because they are protectors of one another. Now, this is a particular verse because if you give it a historical context, this was in the 7th century, during the time when there were a lot of battles, a lot of mistrust, a lot of suspicion, a lot of fear that Jews and Christians would become friends with the Muslims to obtain military secrets, to give it to the enemy. Just 18 verses down, same chapter, is another verse. And this is a universal verse. It says, it doesn't matter what your religion is. Whether you are a Jew, or a Christian, or a Sabian. What matters is, do you have faith in God? But more importantly, are you doing righteous deeds? Because this is what takes you to heaven. And if you read the Quran, there are several verses that says, it doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what your religion is. What takes you to heaven primarily is doing righteous deeds, righteous deeds, righteous deeds. The Quran says, if God wanted, God could have made all the people on earth one single community. But God chose, out of a divine design, to create diversity. For two reasons. One is you might come to get to know the other, establish human relationships with the other, who is different, even difficult for you. And the other one, the Quran says, if you have to compete, compete in doing righteous deeds. I want to give you one more example because this is one which I present quite often in out-of-state presentations. There is one verse 385 which says, anyone who accepts a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted of him, and he will be one of the losers in the hereafter. I always tell people, you know, you have time, please make a note, it's 385. But 384 is probably, the verse preceding that, is probably one of the most inclusive verses of the Quran. It says, we accept what God has revealed to us. We also accept and honor what has been revealed to Abraham, to Ishmael, to Isaac, to Jacob, and the tribes. We honor and accept what has been revealed to Moses and to Jesus. We accept all that has been revealed to prophets, and we make no distinction between the prophets. So the previous one was, or the subsequent one, 385, is a particular verse which needs a deeper understanding when it says, anybody who accepts a religion other than Islam. This verse came before Islam was even a religion. What does Islam mean, literally? It means to surrender in peace. And what are you surrendering in peace? The Quran suggests you are surrendering your attachment to your nafs, which means your ego, so that you can bring, as the Quran says, a heart turned in devotion to God. So what 385 is saying, that it will be not accepted of him, it means that it doesn't matter what your religion is. But if you don't practice Islam, which means this lifelong work and process of surrendering your attachment to your ego, if you don't do this inner work, yes, you will be one of the losers in the hereafter. That's the meaning of that verse. So just take a few moments to, again, absorb this. Whatever your tradition is, particular verses, universal verses. My prayer is, may I not make those particular verses universal verses. And now I want to say, to the question, are there difficult verses in the Quran? Yes, there are. Even if I factor in the textual context, historical context, there are harsh verses, difficult verses. Sufi sages, in response to somebody who gets very excited saying, but all my verses are divine, the sage would say, I know, they're divine. But human consciousness is less than divine. And when human consciousness touches a divine verse, the understanding can be less than divine. What do we do with difficult verses? Even after we do the historical context, the textual context, if we believe they're divine, we have no choice but to shine a higher light upon it. You see, Rumi says, a bee and a wasp, they drink from the same flower, but one produces a sting and the other one produces a nectar. How we interpret a verse really depends, Rumi says, on two things. What is my level of consciousness? And secondly, what is my intention? And we must have the spiritual courage and the grace to say, if we enrich it with the historical context, that yes, this verse was meaningful, was relevant in the 7th century, but does not have relevance and meaning in the 21st century. This is particularly important when we look at the problem areas in our religion. Some of you might know in our community here, over the last 20 years, we've had people, especially in the monotheistic traditions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who became friends. And then after they became friends, they did some deep dialogue where they began to ask one another, what is difficult and awkward, not in your tradition, in my tradition? Let us share what is difficult and awkward in my tradition. As some of you know, I work actively with my interfaith amigos. We travel the country. We've done well over 200 formal presentations in schools, universities, seminaries, churches. And from the questions we have received and the feedback from the workshops, it's clear. Whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, there are 4 problem areas. What are they? Number 1, exclusivity. Number 2, violence. Number 3, unequal status of women. Number 4, homophobia. Just leave with that for a few moments. A third point I wanted to make, or another point I wanted to make, I always remember my mother particularly saying that there's no such thing as the Quran says this or that. The question is, who says the Quran says this or that? And she would jokingly say, it's always the bearded assembly. Meaning it's always men. Every verse in the Quran from any holy book is subject to interpretation, and in the monotheistic tradition, certainly Islam, it is infused with patriarchal bias. Let me give you one very good example. If you look at chapter 4, verse 34, women have claimed for a long time, this is one verse that has given them so much pain because of patriarchal interpretation. The verse says, I'm just paraphrasing, if you suspect your wife of infidelity, you remove yourself from her, you separate your bed from her, and then the word is adribihunna, you beat her. Now, men and women both agree it has its roots in a word called daraba. And it is fascinating that 99% of men use that particular meaning of daraba as to hit her, to beat her. But that word daraba, the root word daraba, has many other meanings. Remove yourself from, turn away from, have consensual intimate relationships. When a woman translates that, she never writes in the translation and hit her. Her interpretation of that word, which is rooted in daraba, is and turn away from her. Or if you have sex, have consensual sex with her. So let me just finish this part. I just want to say a few more words about ISIS or Isil, so-called ISIS or Isil. By quoting Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said, even if the religious judge advises you about earthly matters, including interpretation, he says, the famous words are, first, consult your heart. I'd like you to be with that for a few moments. First, consult your heart. Okay, very quickly. So-called ISIS or Isil or Daesh in the Arabic acronym, it is critical we take responsibility for our contribution to the creation of this organization. When I say we, I mean the United States government as also Muslim countries. Take the example of Taliban. It is a well-known fact that the US government, our government, they knew the extreme religious views of Osama bin Laden, of Taliban, but they were recruited, they were paid, they were armed, they were encouraged, they were exalted as heroes. As long as they were maiming and killing Russians. The Pakistani government, the Muslim government, was maintaining a wonderful relationship with the Taliban to use them in their fight against India over the Kashmir dispute. So we have to take responsibility. Same thing with ISIS or Isil. You might know or not know that they have existed before they've appeared today in Iraq or Syria. They were known for their absolute murderous, barbaric cruelty. They have been doing beheadings for a long time, but they were beheading Muslims in Syria. But we had, from our government, US delegations go and meet them, call them heroes. John McCain met Baghdadi, who was the leader of the Isil group, and told him he was a great hero because they were maiming and killing our enemy, who's a dictator, President Assad's army in Syria. But the moment they turn against those who use them, our tune, our tone changes. And this is something we have to examine within ourselves. In the Sufi tradition, there's a little saying that says, "He who perfumes a scorpion will not escape its sting." Be with that. Another question I'm asked is, how come ISIL? It's small in number. They're hardened in battle, but they're very small in number. How come they are so successful? Well, you see, if you look deeper, if you see the landscape of that area, if you have knowledge of what is happening politically, even religiously, you'll realize that this little group, ISIL, has the support of the Sunni tribesmen both of Iraq and Syria, of the Sunni members of the Iraqi former army of Saddam Hussein, of these recruits who are rushing over, young people who are rushing over there. Why is that? Because this Sunni population that I've mentioned, they feel oppressed, repressed, denied, dominated by who? By the Shiite government, central government of Baghdad. You see, Iraq is a majority Shia country. And rightfully, through democratic elections, there's a Shiite Islamic government, which is a central government. And why are they so angry at the Sunnis? Because when Saddam Hussein was in power, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. And he repressed the Shiites. And Iraq is a 60% majority Shiite Muslim country. Almost 40% are Sunnis. I hope I've confused you a little bit. So President Obama is very right when he says, if I bomb ISIL, I'm also bombing those Sunni tribesmen. I'm bombing those Ba'athist, that's the party of Saddam Hussein, Ba'athist members who are Sunnis. I'm bombing also the members of the former Sunni members of the Iraqi army, most of whom are moderates. Some are actually secularists. So Obama has gone on record in saying, I am going to become the air force of the Shiite government unless the Shiite government becomes inclusive politically of the Sunnis. So he's absolutely right saying there is no way you can have a military victory unless you also do the political work of being inclusive. If you look into Syria, President Assad, who is a dictator, he is an Alawite Muslim, which is an offshoot of Shiite. And the Shiites in Syria are a minority. The majority are Sunnis. It's the opposite of Iraq. Are you keeping up with me so far a little bit? And the people who are fighting Assad's government is called the Free Syrian Army, Sunnis, but also Isil, so-called Isil, also Sunni. So President Obama is saying, if I listen to the hawks in the administration, in the Pentagon, that I bomb Assad, who is a dictator, sure, I'm helping this Syrian Free Army, but I'm also helping Isil, who will overpower the Free Syrian Army. How many of you know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite? Some of you do know? That's fantastic, because here's the problem. See, the level of discussion we're having in this country about the political landscape in the Middle East, about Islam, is without very much knowledge. I brought along, I think I've got the right one, an article written at the height when Bush was in Iraq. This is in close to 2007. From the New York Times, Jeff Stein, he said, you know, we must know our enemy, Sunnis and Shiites. So he went to all the top people, those who deal with counterterrorism. He went to Congress and asked them a single question. Do you know the difference between Shia and Sunni? And guess what? The majority of them said, I have no idea. So he writes, yes, it could be a gotcha question, but really it's just the basics. After all, wouldn't British counterterrorism officials responsible for Northern Ireland know the difference between Catholics and Protestants? He says, but so far, most American officials I've interviewed don't have a clue. That includes not just intelligence and law enforcement officials, but also members of Congress who have important roles overseeing our spy agencies. How can they do their jobs without knowing the basics? So he describes one meeting he had with a Republican who heads the House Intelligence Subcommittee charged with overseeing CIA's performance in recruiting Islamic spies and analyzing information. He asked her, do you know the difference? And he writes, she was dumbfounded when I asked her. Do I, she asked me? A look of concentration came upon her face. You know I should. She took a stab at it. It's a difference in their fundamental religious beliefs. The Sunnis are more radical than the Shiites, or vice versa. But I think it's the Sunnis who are more radical than the Shia. So anyway, he ends with this paragraph, which is very important. He says, but as I keep asking it around Capitol Hill and the agencies, I get more and more blank stares. Too many officials in charge of the war on terrorism just don't care to learn much, if anything, about the enemy we're fighting. And that's enough to keep anybody up at night. So, really, as I bring it to a close, we know that a little knowledge is dangerous. But having no knowledge at all is, I think, a little bit more dangerous. So it's critical we really have a basic appreciative understanding of religion and the politics of that part of the world before we make many strong judgments. So let me end by saying something spiritual. So what do we do in this difficult situation? What is one spiritual perspective? Yes, in certain times we have to use force, but we know that violence begets violence. This campaign, whether it's bombing or boots on the ground, is bound to fail unless we do this difficult political work of really being inclusive of all the minorities. But more important than that, it behooves all of us, and this is the hardest work of all, to be spiritual about this. You know, all the great traditions have said, including Islam, when you deal with the other who is an enemy, please, 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 I beg you, please make a spiritual discernment between behavior and being. A person's behavior might be evil, but a person's being, a person's essence can never be evil. It is sacrosanct. It is Christ nature, Elohim nature, Allah nature, Buddha nature. And the great sages say, just keeping this discernment, this distinction in our minds and hearts as we deal with the other has the power to shift heaven and earth. If we don't, say the great sages, we shall lapse into self-righteousness. The danger is in fighting extremism, I might become extreme. In fighting injustice, I might become unjust. So let me end with that wonderful saying by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I always remember, who said famously, if only it was that simple, that there are some evil people out there, and all you have to do is to separate them, isolate them, and destroy them. He goes on to say, alas, the truth is, the line dividing good and evil runs in every single human heart. And he ends by saying, and who is willing to tear a piece of his or her own heart?